not to convict. And we say that on Senator Specter because he plans to vote that the charges were not proven instead of voting guilty or not guilty. We're also led to believe that the Chief Justice will tell him that that's not allowed by the rules, and his vote will be counted as present. But we know for sure the president is not going to be removed from office. We also know that there's not going to be a censure of the president. Republicans have put parliamentary machinery in order to block that. But a censure resolution will be offered. It's been signed by 27 Democrats and 9 Republicans. Senator Feinstein of California, Senator Bennett of Utah have been sponsoring that. But that, too, will not even reach a majority of the Senate, Dan.
Bob, why does the Republican leadership want to block a vote on censure? What's in it for them, or what do they see as in for the country by doing that?
Well, to me, that is one of the most curious aspects of all of this. The Republicans say, from a political standpoint, that a censure vote is just a cover. It's a chance for Democrats to say that they have punished the president but have not removed him from office. But in a funny kind of way, it's like a prosecutor saying to a jury, look, if you're not going to give this person the death penalty, just turn him free, because the result of that is going to be the president is going to walk away from this without even a verbal reprimand from the United States Senate.
Thanks, Bob. So there's no confusion. Acquittal for the president on both of the charges now seems assured. Acquittal would take 67 votes in the Senate, 2/3 of the Senate. We do have a little bit of tension here, if you will. The first charge, perjury, seems destined not to get even a simple majority. The question now, and about the only question remaining, is will a simple majority, 51 votes or more, vote for obstruction of justice? Italicizing again, that would not mean the president would be removed from office. It would be a kind of, if you will, psychological victory for the Republicans to get more than a simple majority for that. So we have that question. Then, once this vote is over, comes the question of censure. And as Bob Schieffer reported, the Republican leadership believes it has enough votes to beat back censure. We go down to Scott Pelley at the White House. By the way, before we do that, let me say that I said acquittal takes 2/3 votes. I should have said conviction, of course, takes 2/3 votes. Conviction takes 2/3 votes. Pretty complicated stuff here this morning, but I think you can follow it along, and so stick with us on our coverage as we go to Scott Pelley at the White House. Scott?
Well, Dan, the White House certainly hopes that neither article will gain a bare majority. They will use that, of course, as a psychological threshold. It doesn't have any practical effect for the White House. But as a psychological threshold, it is important because then it will allow the president's aides to claim that the prosecution of the president was illegitimate all along. Of course, you will not be hearing the president make any such claim himself. The White House is eager to avoid the same sort of scene from December the 19th, the very day that the president was impeached, when you'll recall the president came out to the South Lawn of the White House and was greeted by Democrats. It was thought later that that scene was much too strident, much more like a pep rally than anything else, and the White House intends to avoid that this time. We are expecting sometime shortly after the last impeachment vote today that the president will make a statement. One of his aides tells us he will be using the statement as, quote, a pivot point to turn the nation away from the obstruction of justice investigation and toward the future. In an effort to help reconcile all sides, we are also looking for Mr. Clinton to invite the leadership from the House and the Senate in the coming days to come here to the White House to discuss the legislative agenda and the new future. Dan?
Scott, who's calling the shots in there? Is the president himself with Mrs. Clinton, or what's the decision-making structure inside?
It's been interesting, Dan, over the last few days. The White House has played this very close to the vest about exactly what the president is going to say and how he is going to say it. We understand that the decision, of course, rests with the president alone. He has only consulted, as of last night, only consulted with 2 or 3 other advisors, and we understand that Mrs. Clinton is also very much involved in the process of deciding exactly how the president will address this and how much weight to give the moment.
Scott Pelley at the White House. Former United States Senator Warren Rubin, Republican of New Hampshire, is a CBS News consultant on the impeachment process with us. Good day to you, Senator. The Senate will not convict the president of either one of these charges. Now, if this doesn't bring peace in our time, will it at least bring peace to this town?
I don't think so. there are some very deeply held feelings on both sides of this issue. I mean, with all the politeness you may hear after this, the fact is there is a deep-seated hatred of the president by many people, particularly in the House, some in the Senate. The New York Times story yesterday about, revenge and so forth, whether it's true or not, you know that the president has very deep feelings directed against members of the House and against Ken Starr. It's almost asking too much to say that people can put them completely aside. Having said that, there will be an honest effort to get legislative things done this year. But, Dan, this is, after all, a lame duck president now in his last 2 years, and historically they don't get much done. Number two, you get a lot of Democrats up there who aren't happy with this situation, being put in this situation. Witness the censure resolution, which is almost as strong as a conviction if you read the language. The difference is it doesn't remove you from office. And so I don't think they feel too good about their president. So it's going to be a very, very difficult 2 years, in my view.
Gloria Borger, CBS News consultant, also works for U.S. News and World Report. Who's going to control the political agenda the next 2 years?
Well, I think right now you'd have to bet on the president. You'd have to bet on the Democrats. He's already very deftly laid out his political agenda in the State of the Union speech. We saw it. And I think for his own legacy, Dan, he's talking about getting something done. And we'll just have to see if he's able to do it.
The Senate has met almost exclusively as a court of impeachment since January 7, 1999, to consider the articles of impeachment against the President of the United States. The Senate meets today to conclude this trial by voting on the articles of impeachment, thereby fulfilling its obligation under the Constitution. I believe we are ready to proceed to the vote on the articles, and I yield the floor.
The chair would inform those in attendance in the Senate galleries that under Rule 19 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, demonstrations of approval or disapproval are prohibited, and it is the duty of the chair to enforce order on his own initiative. The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
This is live, and this will be the vote.
Article 1. In his conduct while President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton, in violation of his constitutional oath, faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, has willfully corrupted and manipulated the judicial process of the United States for his personal gain and exoneration, impeding the administration of justice in that. On August 17, 1998, William Jefferson Clinton swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before a federal grand jury of the United States. Contrary to that oath, William Jefferson Clinton willfully provided perjurious, false, and misleading testimony to the grand jury concerning one or more of the following. 1. The nature and details of his relationship with a subordinate government employee. 2. Prior perjurious, false, and misleading testimony he gave in a federal civil rights action brought against him. 3. Prior false and misleading statements he allowed his attorney to make to a federal judge in that civil rights action. And 4, his corrupt efforts to influence the testimony of witnesses and to impede the discovery of evidence in that civil rights action. In doing this, William Jefferson Clinton has undermined the integrity of his office, has brought disrepute on the presidency, has betrayed his trust as president, and has acted in a manner subversive of the rule of law and justice to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, William Jefferson Clinton, by such conduct, warrants impeachment and trial, and removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The chair reminds the Senate that each senator, when his name or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty, as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. The chair also refers to Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment. Quote, "No person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present." The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, William Jefferson Clinton, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Abraham. Guilty. Mr. Abraham, guilty. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Akaka, not guilty. Mr. Allard. Mr. Allard, guilty. Mr. Ashcroft. Guilty. Mr. Ashcroft, guilty. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, not guilty. Mr. Bye. Not guilty. Mr. Bye, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden, not guilty. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, not guilty. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond, guilty. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, not guilty. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Breaux, not guilty. Mr. Brownback. Mr. Brownback, guilty. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bryan, not guilty. Mr. Bunning. Mr. Bunning, guilty. Mr. Burns. Guilty. Mr. Burns, guilty. Mr. Byrd. Mr. Byrd, not guilty. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell, guilty. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Chafee, not guilty. Mr. Cleland. Mr. Cleland, not guilty. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Conrad. Not guilty. Mr. Conrad, not guilty. Mr. Coverdale. Mr. Coverdale, guilty. Mr. Craig. Mr. Craig, guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, guilty. Mr. Daschle. Mr. Daschle, not guilty. Mr. DeWine. Mr. DeWine, guilty. Mr. Dodd. Mr. Dodd, not guilty. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Domenici, guilty. Mr. Dorgan. Mr. Dorgan, not guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, not guilty. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, not guilty. Mr. Enzi. Guilty. Mr. Enzi, guilty. Mr. Feingold. Mr. Feingold, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, not guilty. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald, guilty. Mr. Frist. Mr. Frist, guilty. Mr. Gorton. Mr. Gorton, not guilty. Mr. Graham of Florida. Mr. Graham of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Graham of Texas. Mr. Graham of Texas, guilty. Mr. Grahams of Minnesota. Mr. Grahams of Minnesota, guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, guilty. Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg, guilty. Mr. Hagel. Mr. Hagel, guilty. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, not guilty. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, guilty. Mr. Helms. Mr. Helms, guilty. Mr. Hollings. Mr. Hollings, not guilty. Mr. Hutchinson of Arkansas. Mr. Hutchinson of Arkansas, guilty. Mrs. Hutchison of Texas. Mrs. Hutchison of Texas, guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, guilty. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, not guilty. Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Jeffords, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. Kerry of Nebraska. Mr. Kerry of Nebraska, not guilty. Mr. Kerry of Massachusetts. Mr. Kerry of Massachusetts, not guilty. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, not guilty. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, guilty. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, not guilty. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, not guilty.
34 votes.
Mr. Levin.
Not guilty means the president is acquitted
Mr.
on
Levin,
this charge.
not guilty. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, not guilty. Mrs. Lincoln.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Lincoln, not guilty. Mr. Lott.
Guilty.
Mr. Lott, guilty. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, guilty. Mr. Mack. Mr. Mack, guilty. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, guilty. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, not guilty. Mr. Moynihan. Mr. Moynihan, not guilty. Mr. Murkowski. Mr. Murkowski, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, not guilty. Mr. Nichols. Mr. Nichols, guilty. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island.
Not guilty.
Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, not guilty. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, not guilty. Mr. Robb. Mr. Robb, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, guilty. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, not guilty. Mr. Roth. Mr. Roth, guilty. Mr. Santorum. Mr. Santorum, guilty. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, not guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, not guilty. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Mr. Smith of New Hampshire. Mr. Smith of New Hampshire, guilty. Mr. Smith of Oregon. Mr. Smith of Oregon, guilty. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, not guilty. Mr. Specter. Mr. Stevens. Mr. Stevens, not guilty. Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, guilty. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, not guilty. Mr. Thurmond. Mr. Thurmond, guilty. Mr. Torricelli. Mr. Torricelli, not guilty. Mr. Voinovich. Mr. Voinovich, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, not guilty. Mr. Wellstone. Mr. Wellstone, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, not guilty.
Vote total, as you will see, it does not add up to 100. The reason is that Arlen Specter, the Republican senator from Pennsylvania, did not, I repeat, did not vote guilty or not guilty. He chose to try to be registered as, quote, unproven. Now, there was no accommodation made for that, and therefore his vote is not registered at all. He's registered as being present. They may be conversing about this at the moment. They're moving to the next article of impeachment.
45 senators having pronounced William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 55 senators having pronounced him not guilty. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty. The Senate adjudges that the respondent, William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
So now officially Arlen Specter has been registered as voting not guilty. The final total on the first charge, 55 to 45. We'll explain more about this later and how the confusion came. 55-45 on the first charge. Now they're reading the second charge. This is the obstruction of justice charge. The outlook is it will be a closer vote, but we shall see. We'll explain the Specter business a little later on.
That the laws be faithfully executed, has prevented, obstructed, and impeded the administration of justice, and has to that end engaged personally and through his subordinates and agents in a course of conduct or scheme designed to delay, impede, cover up, and conceal the existence of evidence and testimony related to a federal civil rights action brought against him in a duly instituted judicial proceeding. The means used to implement this course of conduct or scheme included one or more of the following acts. 1. On or about December 17, 1997, William Jefferson Clinton corruptly encouraged a witness in a federal civil rights action brought against him to execute a sworn affidavit in that proceeding that he knew to be perjurious, false, and misleading. 2. On or about December 17, 1997, William Jefferson Clinton corruptly encouraged a witness in a federal civil rights action brought against him to give perjurious, false, and misleading testimony if and when called to testify personally in that proceeding. 3. On or about December 28, 1997, William Jefferson Clinton corruptly engaged in encouraged, or supported a scheme to conceal evidence that had been subpoenaed in a federal civil rights action brought against him. 4. Beginning on or about December 7, 1997, and continuing through and including January 14, 1998, William Jefferson Clinton intensified and succeeded in an effort to secure job assistance to a witness in a federal civil rights action brought against him in order to corruptly prevent the truthful testimony of that witness in that proceeding at a time when the truthful testimony of that witness would have been harmful to him. 5. On January 17, 1998, at his deposition in a federal civil rights action brought against him, William Jefferson Clinton corruptly allowed his attorney to make a false and misleading statements to a federal judge characterizing an affidavit in order to prevent questioning deemed relevant by the judge. Such false and misleading statements were subsequently acknowledged by his attorney in communication to that judge. 6. On or about January 18th and January 20th through 21st, 1998, William Jefferson Clinton related a false and misleading account of events relevant to a federal civil rights action brought against him to a potential witness in that proceeding in order to corruptly influence the testimony of that witness. 7. On or about January 21st, 23rd, and 26th, 1998, William Jefferson Clinton made false and misleading statements to potential witnesses in a federal grand jury proceeding in order to corruptly influence the testimony of those witnesses. The false and misleading statements made by William Jefferson Clinton were repeated by witnesses to the grand jury, causing the grand jury to receive false and misleading information. In all of this, William Jefferson Clinton has undermined the integrity of his office, has brought disrepute on the presidency, has betrayed his trust as president, and has acted in a manner subversive of the rule of law and justice, to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, William Jefferson Clinton, by such conduct, warrants impeachment and trial, and removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, William Jefferson Clinton, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Abraham. Guilty. Mr. Abraham, guilty. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Akaka, not guilty. Mr. Allard. Guilty. Mr. Allard, guilty. Mr. Ashcroft. Guilty. Mr. Ashcroft, guilty. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, not guilty. Mr. Bye. Mr. Bye, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden, not guilty. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, not guilty. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond, guilty. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, not guilty. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Breaux, not guilty. Mr. Brownback. Mr. Brownback, guilty. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bryan, not guilty. Mr. Bunning. Guilty. Mr. Bunning, guilty. Mr. Burns. Guilty. Mr. Burns, guilty. Mr. Byrd. Mr. Byrd, not guilty. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell, guilty. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Chafee, not guilty. Mr. Cleland. Mr. Cleland, not guilty. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, not guilty. Mr. Coverdell. Mr. Coverdell, guilty. Mr. Craig. Mr. Craig, guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, guilty. Mr. Daschle. Mr. Daschle, not guilty. Mr. DeWine. Mr. DeWine, guilty. Mr. Dodd. Mr. Dodd, not guilty. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Domenici, guilty. Mr. Dorgan. Mr. Dorgan, not guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, not guilty. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, not guilty. Mr. Enzi.
Guilty.
Mr. Enzi, guilty. Mr. Feingold. Mr. Feingold, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, not guilty. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald, guilty. Mr. Frist. Mr. Frist, guilty. Mr. Gorton. Mr. Gorton, guilty. Mr. Graham of Florida. Mr. Graham of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Graham of Texas. Mr. Graham of Texas, guilty. Mr. Graham's in Minnesota. Mr. Graham's in Minnesota, guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, guilty. Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg, guilty. Mr. Hagel.
Guilty.
Mr. Hagel, guilty. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, not guilty. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, guilty. Mr. Helms. Mr. Helms, guilty. Mr. Hollings. Mr. Hollings, not guilty. Mr. Hutchinson of Arkansas. Mr. Hutchinson of Arkansas, guilty. Mrs. Hutchinson of Texas. Mrs. Hutchinson of Texas, guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, guilty. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, not guilty. Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Jeffords, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. Carey of Nebraska. Mr. Carey of Nebraska, not guilty. Mr. Carey of Massachusetts. Mr. Carey of Massachusetts, not guilty. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, not guilty. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, guilty. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, not guilty. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, not guilty. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, not guilty. Mr. Lieberman.
34 votes, not guilty.
Mr. Lieberman,
It means the president
not
also
guilty.
is acquitted on this charge.
Mrs. Lincoln.
He is acquitted on both charges.
Mrs. Lincoln, not guilty. Mr. Lott. Mr. Lott, guilty. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, guilty. Mr. Mack. Mr. Mack, guilty. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, guilty. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, not guilty. Mr. Moynihan. Mr. Moynihan, not guilty. Mr. Murkowski. Mr. Murkowski, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, not guilty. Mr. Nichols. Mr. Nichols, guilty. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, not guilty. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, not guilty. Mr. Robb. Mr. Robb, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, guilty. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, not guilty. Mr. Roth. Mr. Roth, guilty. Mr. Santorum. Mr. Santorum, guilty. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, not guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, not guilty. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Sessions, Mr. Shelby, guilty. Mr. Smith of New Hampshire. Mr. Smith of New Hampshire, guilty. Mr. Smith of Oregon. Mr. Smith of Oregon, guilty. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, not guilty. Mr. Spector. Mr. Spector, not guilty. Mr. Stevens. Mr. Stevens, guilty. Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, guilty. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, guilty. Mr. Thurmond. Mr. Thurmond, guilty. Mr. Torricelli. Mr. Torricelli, not guilty. Mr. Voinovich. Mr. Voinovich, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Wellstone. Mr. Wellstone, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, not guilty. What do you think?
50-50 is the final total. Keep in mind it took 67 votes to convict the president. On both of the accusations against him, the president is found not guilty. And that's the storyline of the hour. The effort to remove President Clinton from office has failed on both charges.
On this article of impeachment, 50 senators have pronounced William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 50 senators have pronounced him not guilty. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The chair directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein. It is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said William Jefferson Clinton be, and he hereby is, acquitted of the charges in the said articles. The chair recognizes the majority leader.
Mr. Chief Justice, there's an order at the desk.
The clerk will read the order.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State, as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of William Jefferson Clinton, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. The chair wishes to make a brief statement without objection, I trust. More than a month ago, I first came here to preside over the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment. I was a stranger to the great majority of you. I underwent the sort of culture shock that naturally occurs when one moves from the very structured environment of the Supreme Court to what I shall call, for want of a better phrase, the more free-form environment of the Senate. I leave you now a wiser but not a sadder man. I have been impressed by the manner in which the majority leader and the minority leader have agreed on procedural rules in spite of the differences that separate their two parties on matters of substance. I have been impressed by the quality of the debate in closed session on the entire question of impeachment as provided for in the Constitution. Agreed upon procedures for airing substantive divisions must be the hallmark of any great deliberative body. Our work as a court of impeachment is now done. I leave you with the hope that our several paths may cross again under happier circumstances. The Majority Leader.
Mr. Chief Justice, we thank you for your comments, and I send a resolution to the desk.
The clerk will read the resolution.
Senate Resolution 37. To express gratitude for the service of the Chief Justice of the United States as presiding officer during the impeachment trial.
Mr. Chief Justice, I ask that it be considered as having been read in its entirety.
The clerk, without objection, will read it in its entirety.
And I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-Res 37, introduced earlier today by Senator Lott and Senator Daschle, and that the resolution be adopted.
Without objection, the resolution is adopted.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table, and any statements that senators wish to make on this be printed at this point in the record. Now, Mr. Chief Justice.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
On behalf of myself and the entire United States Senate, we want to offer you our thanks and the gratitude of the American people for your service to the nation and throughout this impeachment court to this institution. As our presiding officer, during most of the last 5 weeks, you have brought to our proceedings a gentle dignity and an unfailing sense of purpose and sometimes a sense of humor. The Majority Leader realized when it was time to take a break and not to take a break when the Chief Justice said, let's go forward. By placing duty above personal convenience and many other considerations, you've taught a lesson in leadership. Your presence in the chair, the President of the Senate, following the directives of our Constitution, gave comity to this chamber and assurance to the nation. I would like to close with our traditional Mississippi parting. Y'all come back soon. But I hope that's not taken the wrong way and not for an occasion like this one. So instead, as you return to your work on the court in the great marble temple of the law right across the lawn from this Capitol, we salute you, sir, with renewed appreciation and esteem for a good friend and good neighbor. And now, Mr. Chief Justice, if the Democratic leader would join you, we have a small token of our appreciation. We have a tradition in the Senate that after you've presided over the Senate for 100 hours, we present you with the Golden Gavel Award. And I'm not sure it quite reached 100 hours, but it's close enough.
With applause for the Chief Justice and laughter, been a lot of laughter in the United States Senate these last few minutes. After well over a year of investigations, political maneuvering, legal maneuvering, after a month of a Senate trial, it's over. The President of the United States found not guilty. He is acquitted on both charges. On charge 1, perjury, 45 senators voted guilty.
I ask unanimous consent that the February 5th,
55
affidavit
voted not guilty. Republican Senators Jeffords of Vermont, Snow of Maine, Chafee of Rhode Island, Collins of Maine, and Spector of Pennsylvania were Republicans crossing over on that first vote, which made it 45 to 55. 55 not guilty, 45 Democrats, 10 Republicans. On the second charge, obstruction of justice, which has for some weeks been considered the more dangerous charge as far as removal of the president was concerned, 50 votes guilty, 50 votes not guilty, straight, long party lines. No Republican crossed over on that vote, no Democrat crossed over on that vote. Sorry. Obstruction of justice. Let's go over it again. 50 and 50. Remember, the Republicans had 55 votes in the Senate. 5 Republicans crossed over on this last vote to leave it 50-50. So we go over the math again. On the first charge, perjury, 45-55, 55 voting not guilty. On the second charge, obstruction of justice, 50-50, 5 Republicans crossing over on that. We go now to Bob Schieffer. Bob, what a day. Whether one considers any of this necessary or not, it is, at least this phase of it, over. Give us some sense of the mood in the Senate today.
It was very interesting, Dan, and I should point out that I'm about, I'd say 20 yards from the Senate chamber itself at our little office here in the United States Capitol, where we had reporters going in and out. They reported that in the beginning, first, there was just an enormous sense of relief that you could sense all the way up into the visitors' galleries. The senators were visiting amongst one another. They were slapping each other on the back. Strom Thurmond, the 96-year-old Republican from South Carolina, gave Cheryl Mills, the White House lawyer, a tangerine. But once the Chief Justice called everybody to order, then there was a real sense of seriousness. People returned to their desk, and I think they realized that this was a historical moment. I think we also need to say, Dan, that this is a real slap at the House prosecutors, that they were unable to raise a majority in support of either article of impeachment. Now, the numbers don't really count because it was 2/3 needed to remove the president from office. But having said that, being unable to raise even a majority in support of either article of impeachment, I think it's going to set off something of a war between the House and Senate. We already saw that beginning last night when the lawyer who headed up the investigation for the House Republicans called the trial a sham. He said the Senate had cut them off at the knees because they wouldn't let them call witnesses and so forth. I think you're going to see more talk of that amongst Republicans. We may have some sort of a who lost China kind of a debate about who lost this for the Republicans. Whatever the case, as you can see, Dan, it looks like those of the House managers are now leaving the Senate floor. This is just outside the Senate chamber. And by the way, Dan, I'm told that Chairman Hyde walked out of the chamber before the Chief Justice was escorted out. In fact, you just saw him there just now, Dan.
Well, it's pretty clear, Bob, that Chairman Hyde of the House Judiciary Committee, who was the major player, a major, if not the major player in the House in getting this whole impeachment thing, the momentum of it rolling, as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, a Republican, he led the effort to report out of the House Judiciary Committee to the full House the 2 articles of, the articles of impeachment. 2 were finally actually passed by the House. So Henry Hyde, along with Tom DeLay and Dick Armey and the leadership of the full House responsible for the impeachment, naturally they're disappointed that the Senate has not gone along with their what amounts to indictments of the president. So it's not too strong to say that they are today beaten, if not defeated, with these 2 votes in the Senate. We go down to the White House, and CBS News White House correspondent Scott Pelley. Well, Scott, there was a time when President Clinton, when he heard some good news from the courts. We're talking now about the regular court system. When he was in Africa, there were pictures of him smoking a cigar and strumming a ukulele. I gather that at least that's not expected today.
That's not expected today, Dan. That was the day back last April when the president, as you say, was in Africa, and he got word that the Paula Jones sexual harassment suit against him had been dismissed. There was a great deal of celebration, at least in private, for the president on that night. But here today, you're not going to be seeing anything like that in public. We are being told that the president will have a statement later today. The president's podium that he has used in past circumstances such as this has been moved out of the White House and is going to a location. We do not know which location yet, but it is a sign around here that the president will have something to say, and will have something to say fairly shortly. We are told by his aides here that the president may acknowledge his responsibility in bringing the nation through all of this over the last 13 months or so, but he is going to use the speech primarily in what one aide called as a pivot point, to move the attention from the nation away from what has just happened and toward the future. He is likely to talk about such things as Social Security and saving Medicaid, for example, 2 of his top legislative proposals. So we will be hearing from the president in a short time. We don't know exactly when, but you can expect some level of contrition and largely a look toward where we go from here. Dan?
Scott Pellett, the White House. Bill Jones, our CBS News correspondent in the studio. What about independent counsel Ken Starr? He's been investigating President Clinton for more than 4 years, spent well over $40 million of taxpayer money in the investigation. And today the Senate has rejected the case that he made against the president, keeping in mind that he came to the House and, in effect, testified against the president. What's in store now for Starr?
Well, as Bob Schieffer was pointing out, that this is a real slap at the House managers, but I think it's also fair to say, as you're indicating here, this is also a huge slap at Kenneth Starr and his independent counsel investigation. But here we are. At this point, the president is not going to be impeached. He got by this. And now, still standing, only one man in his way, is still Kenneth Starr, the independent counsel. And during this trial, remember, there was the leak quoting someone from Starr's office indicating that they were thinking about seeking a criminal indictment against the president. Well, the problem with that is that the constitutional question of whether or not he can do it, and by the time they would resolve that, it would take months, and the president has, what, about 23 months left. And also, you have the whole question of whether or not the statute of limitations would still be in effect. As of now, it would be there until the year 2003. So there is still that possibility that Kenneth Starr may decide to go ahead and seek a criminal indictment on basically the same charges, perjury and obstruction of justice.
Ken Starr has been very tenacious up to, including the present time. Is there any reason, Phil, to believe that he won't be just as tenacious in pursuing President Clinton in the courts, whether while he's still a president or after he leaves the presidency?
Well, based on his record, you would have to say, yes, he's going to be just as tenacious. But I think at some point, Kenneth Starr also has to look at public opinion. Public opinion told these members of the Senate that they were sick and tired of this. Surely that had something to do with the result today. I think he would have to weigh that, and he'd have to decide whether or not, if he decides to take this into an ordinary courtroom, whether or not he could get a jury out there to convict the president. And I think this is a big question. Also, he has another problem, and that is many of his attorneys who have been with him throughout this whole thing are either leaving or trying to leave. Plus, he has other trials out there that he still has to prosecute, Susan McDougal, Webb Hubbell, and things like that. So his plate is full at this point.
Well, as the year-long crisis surrounding President Clinton has cooled off, hold on just a moment. Maybe breaking news. Go to Bob Schieffer and find out what's happening on the Senate floor just now. Bob?
Well, Dan, as we expected, once the trial was over, the Senate reconvened in regular legislative session. Senator Feinstein got up and made a motion to introduce her resolution of censure. Senator Graham of Texas, as expected, objected to that and asked that the vote be postponed. They're now voting on that right now to postpone the vote. Bottom line of this is what is going to happen, that as a result of this roll call vote, the censure resolution will be postponed and will fail. There were, I think it was 27 Democrats and 9 Republicans who had signed this letter of censure, and it is a very strong censure. It accuses the president of shameless behavior and so on, and even stronger language. But everybody knew in advance what was going to happen. This is going to fail. So that's what's happening right now. They're just going through the motions and going through the vote to put it on the record. But Senator Feinstein has just introduced a resolution of censure, and they're now voting to block it from being introduced.
Mrs. Boxer.
President Clinton acquitted on both charges against him, 55-45 on the first vote, 50-50 on the second vote. And then, after the Senate reconvened, the Republican leadership, as it promised it would, has beaten back an effort to immediately introduce a censure. Now, that doesn't mean that down the road the president can't be censured. True or untrue, Senator Rudman?
Oh, absolutely true. As a matter of fact, what I would expect to happen is when the Senate comes back from recess, there would be an attempt to see whether or not they could muster the 60 votes required to overtake a filibuster attempt by Senator Graham. If, in fact, they could, I would expect Senator Feinstein would attempt to reintroduce that resolution.
So, while the president isn't going to be censured today, it's still possible that he will be censured by the Senate.
It certainly is possible, Dan. It depends whether or not Senator Feinstein believes upon returning a week from now whether she and Senator Bennett believe they have sufficient votes to overcome a filibuster. If they do, I expect they would go forward.
Gloria Borger, you've covered the Congress for a very long time. Is it likely or unlikely to get a censure? If you don't want to predict, where does this go from here? Does this really put a period on it, or are we still going to go through some more days of discussing about it?
I think we are going to go through some more days of discussing about it, but it's the language, Dan, that's really the problem here, because it's too tough for a lot of Democrats who voted not guilty. It says that he deliberately misled and deceived the American people, for example. So what's the difference? They're saying this is too tough for us. Some Republicans say we don't want to let the Democrats off the hook. Strange reasoning. And so it's getting together this language that has been so difficult for Dianne Feinstein, and I don't know that she's going to have any better luck when they come back from a week off than she is having right now. It's been very frustrating for her and for Senator Bennett of Utah as well. They've both tried to get a bipartisan vote. They wanted an overwhelming bipartisan vote on this. This is, after all, what the public wants. And I think it may prove to be elusive for them when they return.
We have only a few seconds remaining here. Let's discuss for a moment what happens to the Clintons as a couple, as a first couple. There's a talk in the air that Hillary Clinton, the First Lady, may want to run for the Senate from somewhere, may want to run for some other office. If Scott Pelley's still with us, Scott, what do you hear on that? Well, Gloria, apparently he's not here. What's been the buzz on Hillary Clinton? She runs or she doesn't run for the Senate?
Well, the buzz is that a lot of people want her to run. One Democratic senator told me that the president actually wants her to run. But there are some people who are saying, why should she aim so low? Why would she want to take orders from Tom Daschle, the Senate leader? She, after all, has been the First Lady of the United States. So why would she want to do that?
Phil Jones, in the seconds we have remaining, what do you hear on Hillary Clinton possibly running for the Senate or running for president or vice president?
What I hear is this, that those people who are responsible for getting good candidates for the Democrats to run in the year 2000 really want her. I think that's where all of the push is coming right now. They would love to have her on the run for a Senate seat.
Have about 15 seconds. Senator Rudden?
I think after what Hillary Clinton has been through, I think she will be very happy to go back to private life. She will be urged to run. She would be a terrific candidate in some places. I do not believe she will run.
Thanks, Senator Rudden. And so the latest, but perhaps not the last, very last chapter in the impeachment trial of President Clinton comes to an end. The question of whether he's going to be censured in some form of the Senate is still out there, although the censure effort was beaten back for this day. We'll just have to wait and see what Kenneth Starr says about possible criminal prosecution of the president. But for the moment, both the Congress and the president are forced to look ahead to try to figure out whether or how to work together for the next 2 years. And the rest of us are left trying to understand what just happened here. As a quest for justice, this may be remembered as another of those modern verdicts like those in the trials of O.J. Simpson, which wind up satisfying nobody and take a long time getting there. For most of the past year, journalists have been over backwards trying to predict what would happen next. Most of their predictions, most of ours, most of mine, were wrong. But that didn't stop journalists from trying. Now, there's a good chance that journalists will spend the next year trying to tell you what it all meant. And there's a good chance that such analysis won't be any more correct than the predictions were. But the timing of today's vote could hardly have been better. As we reflect on this Senate verdict over the weekend, we observe Lincoln's birthday and President's Day, a time we celebrate the ideals of American leadership. And we observe Valentine's Day, a celebration of forgiveness and love. We'll be needing all of those qualities this weekend and for a long time to come. Now, CBS will be back on the air when President Clinton speaks to the nation. He's expected to do so a little later on, and we'll have complete coverage of the day's events, of course, on tonight's CBS Evening News. For now, Dan Rather, reporting from Washington, D.C., on a day when the President of the United States has been acquitted on both of the impeachment charges against him, acquitted by the United States Senate. See you later.
For news 24 hours a day, CBS.com on the Internet and on America Online at keyword CBS News.